Hello, and welcome to Mangasplaining, the show where we recommend great manga to folks who haven't read much manga before. Hosted by Deb Aoki, David Brothers, Chip Zdarsky, and myself, Christopher Woodrow Butcher, along with our show notes and reading list at mangasplaining.com and our publishing endeavor at mangasplainingextra.com. This week, hi, I'm Christopher. I'm hosting, and we are starting off season 5 of Mangasplaining, if you can believe it. Seasons tend to be about 25 episodes, except they actually tend to be about 30 something. This is episode 117 or 18 or something like that. We've done a bunch of individual ones. And honestly, as we're recording this, all of last season's episodes still haven't gone up. You know, we're all busy people who are out there making manga and traveling the world. Even Chip has left his house in Toronto for the first time in 2 years to go to filthy comic book conventions. How's that been, Chip?
Scary. It's good. It's good to actually see people that read the books. But yeah, it's a different world out there, and I'm a scared boy. Yeah.
David, what have you been up to in the last 2 months or so? Since we went to Japan in November, actually, we got together, me, you, and Deb.
Yeah, mostly just making anime music videos from fighting games on my YouTube channel.
I have snuck a couple links to those into the show notes for people who were curious. I hope you don't mind too much.
It's sort of a way to summarize my experience with the game, or with the moment of the game, or just get an idea out there in the form of a 1 to 2 minute music video, a little, not even a highlight reel because they're not always great shots, but something fun. And it's writing is so easy for me now that I need to expand into video. So
I've already mastered writing. What's next? Yeah,
I know all the letters. So come on.
Amazing.
Deb, you've become a teacher in the off season, have you? Is that what I heard? You're teaching manga now? That's wild.
It is wild. Justin Hall caught me in a moment of weakness and asked me if I'd like to teach a class on manga for the California College of Arts MFA in Comics program. Ha ha ha. Yeah, now I'm on week 4. I'm making up the curriculum as I go.
What's your class called?
I mean, I call it Manga History, Context, and Creation, which means I kind of talk about a little bit about the history, and then I talk about here's the context in which people create manga in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
How their career path goes and what the business is like. And then I get into teaching them, I guess, how to think like how manga artists, not necessarily how to draw like them. So how to think about Kisho Tenketsu, the introduction, the development, the twist, and then the resolution. And how over time you're increasing the reader's emotional investment in the story. And then the cycles and Komawari, which is the panel flow, guiding the eye to the next panel and things like that. So more mechanical things like that.
Oh, interesting. So sorry, you had an opportunity to brand this Mangasplaining and you didn't.
I could not.
Wow. Unbelievable.
But you do shout out the podcast every single class, right? You're like, oh, I'm just going to record a Mangasplaining tomorrow. It's my podcast. Extra credit if you listen, and leave a review on Apple.
It is actually the last slide on every deck, by the way.
I was joking, but of course you're one step ahead of me. That's perfect.
Yeah. Good job.
And actually, some of the students have said, yeah, you guys know a lot.
And I keep forgetting, when I do books at Image, I have control over the ad pages, and I never even think to put an ad for Mangasplaining in there. I should do a full page ad that they run and everything.
I'd buy that one.
I'm
for the ad.
I'm on it. I'll do it.
Nice.
Well, that's a good segue into this week's book, actually. We wanted to kick the season off. If you don't remember, I think 5 or 6 episodes ago, I was like, I will forego my last pick of season 4 in hopes of us reading something very different for the first pick of season 5. And that is the nonfiction history book, guide, whatever you want to call it. Manga, The World of Japanese Comics by Frederik Schodt. As the cover says, it won the Osamu Tezuka Culture Award Special Prize 1 year as well. And it has, quotes on the back from the New Yorker and Variety, so it must be good. I wanted to do this because I honestly think that the best way to enjoy manga is to just throw people into the deep end. And that's kind of what we did with Mangasplaining in the first couple episodes. We all kind of decided on what the first book would be. And David's like, let's just do Akira because Akira is the best comic of all time. And I was like, well, you can't argue with that. So yeah, let's just do it Akira. And it's also a pretty high watermark. So Chip probably wouldn't reject all of manga all at once. Like if we had done, I don't know, Nausicaa first or something like that. So that was good. But I felt like 4 seasons in, maybe we should actually get a learned, educated person to impart information about the manga industry directly into Chip's brain, into all of our brains as a refresher. I'm sure we've all read this before. So I want to do this episode a little bit differently. This book has a lot of text and images, which is really interesting. And then it is a collection of comics at the back, which is also interesting. I want to talk about the comics sort of last. I really want to just focus on going through the book section by section, just to get everyone's thoughts on the book as we go. But first off, let's start off with just like a general, hey, what did you think of Manga by Frederik Schodt? And I want to start with Deb, because I know Deb has read it before, and or at least dipped in and out, as we all do, to find relevant quotes for our PowerPoint slides. Deb, what did you think about sitting down to read Manga from start to finish?
It's kind of wild because this was the book. This was such an important book for me.
Me too, honestly.
Like it was something where I had been reading manga in Japanese, or struggling to read manga in Japanese, since I was 8 years old, and was just kind of like stumbling my way through it. Like, just kind of like, oh, it's comics. It's in another language. This was the first time reading this book was the first time someone gave me context that I had never had before. Like that there was comics for different age groups and different genders. That there were some manga that were extremely violent, and there was silly. There was things,
sexy.
Just kind of like blew my mind. Like, wow, it's all this? Because you grew up reading Archie, Little Dot, Superman, and even Spider-Man, and you're like, what the heck is going on here? Right? Almost none of this stuff, when I read it in 1983, was available in English, with maybe the exception of Barefoot Gen. So being able to see all of this in context, and and I'm Japanese American too, right? So it was kind of like it gave me a window into my culture as well.
That's one of the things that I found most interesting, I guess, about this book, is that it was written in 1983, and it's before everything that we know about as the contemporary North American manga industry. He's pretty clear the North American manga industry doesn't exist. He actually says at one point, yeah, except for Barefoot Gen, like nothing's translated in English, actually, and nothing ever will. And this book was like the first Tezuka in English, the first, the Rose of Versailles, the comics that are in here were the first comics in a lot of ways. And he led the charge to have a lot more stuff translated that ended up coming out through Eclipse and Viz and things like that. So a lot of this book is written sort of on the cusp of something amazing that happened. And as we were just talking about before the episode starts, this is a, let's say, 1996 revision, which has just got some updated stats and things like that. But frankly, the difference between the industry in 1983 and 1996 was so big. 1997, sorry. It was so big that he would have had to write an entirely different book. And he did, but no spoilers. We'll talk about that a little bit. David, had you read Manga before?
I did when I was between like 14 and 16. Like I bought the 97 version when it was new, when I was living as a kid in Virginia. And it was before I really knew much about manga. Like it wasn't very accessible yet. There were like the single issues that Viz was doing, like the Viz Communications Dragon Ball, I think. Something like that. Anyway, I wasn't reading them, but I knew about it because of anime. Like I kind of realized that some anime had come from somewhere else, so that it was like based on something. So this was kind of my original window to the world of Japanese comics, to the point where when I finally saw Barefoot Gen in the video store, I knew what it was and had to rent it, and then was like horrified by the end of it. Still, I owned that movie for a long time and still only watched it maybe twice, but I really enjoyed it. But it was just like such like a strong impact as a kid. And I think this book really helped prime me for something like that, like knowing what to look for and kind of building taste. But this time around, I read a slightly older version than the rest of the game, minus the 1986 version. So there's no 97 in here at all. I was struck by how it's like 2 or 3 major changes in the industry behind.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned, there was no American comic or an American manga industry yet, but there's also no Takahashi, no Dragon Ball. There's none of like the Shonen Jump to anime pipeline that we have now that like has really changed manga in a lot of ways. So it was really interesting, but I was struck by like how old fashioned it seemed at the same time.
I want to get into that because there is definitely an old fashioned sheen to some of it. Like some of it is still very accurate and very real. And some of it, we've just learned different things since this book came out and more research has been done. The industry's changed in so many ways. But I did actually like that you mentioned Dragon Ball right away, because Dragon Ball doesn't exist when this book's written. He's talking about how this hot new young creator, Akira Toriyama, is like, Dr. Slump is doing so well, 4 volumes in and it sold whatever. And it's like, oh man, in 10 years, Dragon Ball is going to take over the entire world. Dragon Ball Slam Dunk, Shonen Jump's going to change everything. And even then, he's talking about these updated stats where Shonen Jump is selling 4 million copies a week in the update, but he doesn't talk about why or what those books are. And I think that's really interesting as well. Before I get to Chip, because I feel like he's going to have a different take, I did want to say both of your experiences really mirrored my own, because I'm an older fella. A lot of the Japanese, I think I mentioned this before, but I was much more familiar with anime through tape trading and through friends giving me anime and, getting stuff from universities and watching fan subbed stuff. And then all of a sudden the like legal releases started showing up at the video stores and renting them and things like that. That was a big deal for me. But I would still encounter comics. I was going to comic book stores all the time. And I had a really good comic store. Shout out to Friendly Neighborhood Comic Shop, which became Comic Warehouse, which I learned over Christmas finally closed in Brampton in Canada. Owners died. What are you going to do? There's no retirement plan for comics. Anyway, not to get too dark with it.
It's 8 in the morning.
Yeah, right? It's 11 in Toronto. And it's midnight in Taiwan. It's Mangasplaining After Dark. So the comic book store I would go to would have these sales. And it was after the black and white bust that happened where like Teenage Mutant Ninja, for those of you who don't know, this would normally be glossed in the show notes, but this is important to manga. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was black and white comic, and it became a smash hit sensation. It was black and white. It was clearly influenced by Japanese comics and anime, right? And then it inspired. They're like, oh, we could print this. We could go to Prenny or one of these little printers and get a 32-page book printed for like no money, something like 12 cents an issue. We could have our own concept, and we could be the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people had the same idea, and publishers and books. And so there was this glut of very cheap, quick black and white comics that followed in the wake of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Some were very good and are remembered to this day, and some are not. And more in the show notes on that. But it also opened a door for black and white comics being sort of more accepted, and manga slid in there. So a lot of publishers like Eclipse, First Comics, Viz, who was distributed at Eclipse at the beginning and then later went on their own, were like, oh, well, if black and white comics are hot right now, we can just license a book and put, 48 pages of comics out, and this is a thing. And so that's a big part of why the early manga was released as single issues, not just because it was the prevalent format, but because it was actually selling for a little while there. And as I mentioned, it collapsed. So they would have quarter bin sales where it was like, I think 25 cents each or 10 for $1 of all this overstock of all these comics that my local shop had bought, thinking that they were going to be, very, very wealthy. They repeated the same mistake with the Valiant Wildstorm crossover. What was that called? Deathmate? Something? Deathmate, thank you. They repeated that with the launch of a couple of other different comics universes that didn't quite pan out.
Fool me 7 or more times.
Yeah, it's comics. It's always just the same thing in cycles over and over again. Anyway, so because of that, though, I'm buying black and white comics, and I'm buying random issues that they can't sell. And every once in a while, I see something cool like a Ranma or They Were 11 or something else I read, some stuff that was clearly influenced by manga. And it just became another random issue that I would enjoy and not have any context for whatsoever, and not be able to find any issues before or after. I think, my first Akira that way, too. Fast forward to like move to Toronto, where I start working at the Beguiling, and they've got a copy of Manga on the shelf. And I picked it up and I realized, oh, there's it's not just this anime. There's this whole comics industry that is better in every single way than the comics industry that I love. I was only a young man can find.
Wait a minute, you figured out it was better? Like, why did you think it was better?
In every way. Because I was reading everything.
Gratuitous nudity.
Yeah, gratuitous nudity was big. BL was also big. But subject matter. This is the book that was like, hey, the stuff that you're reading, where they're just kind of, it's like the stuff in English is sci-fi. No, man, there's a whole friggin' world of comics that we're not really getting in English, and it's I know he's become a huge problem subsequently, but like Warren Ellis would go on about nurse novels, how it's like if every novel in the novel store was a nurse novel. It's kind of like superhero comics and going to the comic book store, or Scott McCloud with his Reinventing Comics book with like everything's an A, but sometimes you can erase part of the A to make it a B, but it's still kind of an A metaphor. I'll put both of those in the show notes. And it was like, oh, there's an industry where actually there's just other stuff. So reading this book literally blew my mind. I couldn't afford it. It was like 30 Canadian dollars or something, 35 Canadian dollars, and I had to eat and buy 2 liters of Diet Coke every day, as we've learned from Scott Pilgrim. But yeah, it was transformative, let's say. Reading it again now, 30 years later, all I could say is I'm glad we read it. But going through point by point, I want to talk about it a little bit and see how everyone else feels about it. Which brings us to Chip. And Chip, you have a reputation on this show and with some of our listeners and some of the people who comment for kind of hating text pages in comics. I think most recently the Suge book, you're like, yeah, there's 40 pages of text at the back of this comic book. I'm not going to read that. And it's like, oh, it actually gives a lot of information about the stories. It was really interesting. You're like, I literally don't care. So I handed you basically 160 pages of back of the book material that gives it.
Well, first of all,
imagine
this is just slander. This is just slander. Straight up.
You know, these episodes are online. People can go listen to you say these things, right?
Yeah, but I'm not saying them in the way that you're saying I'm saying them. I'm respectfully disagreeing. And also your examples those are like supplementary. This is the text. Like there's a huge difference. There's a huge difference between like somebody adding 40 pages of footnotes to a comic versus a book that is just about comics, and it's the text. Like I can read. I can read a novel. I read lots of novels. I can. Like it's not like I'm like, oh, the text. What am I going to do? How am my eyes going to handle this?
And you know, your last shout out of the season was Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. That was even a nonfiction piece of writing, actually. As well.
I'm not a.
What
dummy.
Am I talking about then?
Dummy, Chris.
All right, tell me, how much did you love this book then?
It's fine. No. I liked it. I liked it a lot. It's weird coming into it. Strangely, I'm coming into it with more knowledge than you came into it with, right? Mm-hmm. So it hits me a bit different. Some of them, like, okay, yeah, of course, yeah, and then BL and comics for girls and sports comics, like explainer comics. Like I know enough about this stuff that it felt kind of additional kind of knowledge. So it didn't blow my mind. There were some interesting things in the history. Just things I just didn't know about Japan, or even the fact that Kodansha is so goddamn old.
Yeah, it's very
I had no
old.
idea. Well, so Kodansha shows up, I'm like, what? So yeah, I mean, I quite liked it. It's a really great introduction to the history of manga. Yeah, and it is weird kind of reading it now, just because like there have been 40 years since this of manga boom. So it felt like it just kind of scratches the surface a little bit because of that fact. But yeah, I still found it interesting.
Well, then I take back everything I just said.
Good.
In detail.
Yeah.
I was struck reading this that it was almost like in the 90s, it would have also been a book. Like it would have made like Manga, the world of Japanese comics. But in the 2000s, this would have been like a long-running weblog. And nowadays, it would probably be more like a podcast of sort of digging into these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Like this book is our competition, is how I feel.
Deb, you got to write that book. You got to write the follow-up to this, is take what David's saying.
That is my dream. I will say that like when this book first came out, he felt compelled to put the subtitle, The World of Japanese Comics. because the word manga was not well known.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, like once upon a time, the word sushi was not well known, right? You had to give it other types of like synonyms to give it like, oh, it's this raw fish and rice, and people go, raw fish and rice. And then people, get to try it and they like it. And now they just say sushi and they never call it by its synonym, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what happened with manga. It's helpful to realize that when this book came out, the word manga was not well known in English at all.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point. I actually I realized something similar while reading this, which is that this is from a world where you had to explain what a ninja was when you mentioned it the first time.
Yeah.
It wasn't that
which
crazy?
Is such a strange thing to think about because like I've never known a life without ninjas. Like I was born when this book came out, like, and that was the cusp of the ninja boom. And it's something we take completely for granted now. And I think the word manga is sort of, it's not there yet, but like it's getting similar. Like it's getting that kind of like saturation.
I have always said that we take ninjas for granted.
Right?
Yeah.
We sure do.
Fully agree.
But I think you couldn't call a book like this the world of Japanese comics anymore because the world is too big to cover in just one book now. Like you could do one of these for shonen manga, for shoujo, for josei, for seinen, for any like specific slice of manga, and still have it be 250 pages.
I mean, no matter what, it's an introductory text. Like this isn't all encompassing even up to this period. This is just like, okay, here's a few examples of this. By the way, there are thousands of other, sports manga out there.
Yeah.
I think you could still do it. You just, you viciously edit it, right?
I should show you like I said, I'm teaching this class, right? So I have to assign textbooks.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't in good conscience assign this book as a textbook because it's old, right? But it is such an important book. But to kind of bring it back to like the difference between then and now, the book I am using as a textbook is a book that just says manga on the cover. It's the British Museum book, and it is 3 times as thick. And it also has like, excerpts of manga, but it talks about the business and it talks about the history and, like all this kind of stuff. But it is 3 times as big and it just has the word manga on the cover. That's how far we've come.
Yeah.
And it's from a huge, a mega exhibit at the British Museum that was funded by Citibank.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at.
Yeah.
The British Museum person, the curator, told me that exhibit was the second most popular exhibit at the British Museum, only beaten by the Viking exhibit.
Oh, it's because Vikings rule.
There you go.
The ninjas of Europe? Yeah, come on.
Yeah.
That's just to give you some context here.
The ninjas of Europe.
Wow.
Oh yeah, those
sneaky
Vikings.
Yeah.
Who just kind of show up on the British shores. Sneaky Vikings.
Strike from the shadows, the Vikings.
And pound your head in.
So let's go into this book. There's a foreword by Tezuka, as well as a foreword to the 1997 edition before the foreword by Schodt himself, where he talks about how things have changed a little bit, but really just hints at the huge changes that have happened to 96 and has no idea of the changes that are pending from 1996 to 2024. But there are sections. 1,000 Million Manga is basically an introduction to the concept of manga. And then from there, 1,000 Years of Manga is like the history of the manga, basically up until and including World War II and the things that happened just afterwards. Basically, the introduction of Tezuka. The Spirit of Japan. It's the shonen and seinen manga that are popular at the time. Flowers and Dreams is the shoujo and newly emerging ladies comics section. The Economic Animal at Work and Play, which is salaryman manga and what we would call explainer manga now, but he calls work comics in this text. Regulation versus Fantasy is about basically the growing gekika, erotic comics, really violent, hyper-violent comics and things like that. And then the comics industry, basically how things work, how it comes together. Finally, there's a chapter called The Future, where he's like, oh, this young Otomo guy, he might turn into something, actually, which I thought was pretty great.
Yeah.
It was a pretty fun chapter. More on that. And then the comics themselves. So I just want to go through and see if anyone has any thoughts on any specific thoughts on these sections. The first one, 1,000 Million Manga. I was actually pleasantly surprised at how good that first section still was at introducing the role that manga plays in Japanese society. It's even bigger now, but the core stuff is still there. It's not outdated. And I thought that was actually pretty interesting. A lot more mangas read obviously on screens than in, tankobon on the subways like he talks about. But I was maybe mostly struck by how definitive his work here, these first 16 pages, became, and how people in North America thought about the manga industry. People like me and David and Deb, where it just sort of was like, oh, this is what manga is and this is what it means to Japan. Did anyone have any thoughts on that? Did it, on that first chapter?
He does something that I actually hate that people do all the time when talking about manga and like American comics. On page 14, he compares Jacqueline Susan's The Valley of the Dolls sales to the combined sales of 65 volumes of a fishing manga, which sold 19 million copies.
Yeah.
And it's like, I get it, but also like this sort of apples to oranges a little bit. It's trying to emphasize how much these things are selling, but it's like, it's not like really a fair comparison when the fact that you sold over 19 million copies is impressive in and of itself to me. Yeah. Like there's always this kind of tension between like manga and comics. Not always, but like often there's this tension between manga and comics as competition when that's really not how I've seen it work out in my life, or not how I see it personally.
Yeah, I mean it's an easy narrative. I mean it even holds true with comics versus comics. Like it's like what a comic sells now versus what a comic sold 40 years ago. Like people have these fights all the time, like, oh, but this industry sucks because it sold this much back then. Like, well, it's a very different industry. Like, yeah,
everything is different. People talk about like how many people watch the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. It's like, and how that's not possible today. It's like because there's a billion more different channels to watch other than the 5 that you had on your TV back then, right?
Yeah, legally you had to watch Ed Sullivan back then. You'd be arrested.
It was that or the news or some other stupid show, and that was your 3 choices.
Yeah. And it's not even apples to oranges as a comparison. It's like an applesauce to apple pie comparison.
Oh,
like I see how you got there. Like they're both good, but like they're also incomparable at the same time in a lot of ways, or at least in like I haven't managed to wrap my head around a way for them to be comparable. But the historical context that he brings along with these comparisons, I thought was really fascinating. Like the more in the past the book was, and kind of the more outside of the realm of what we've had translated over here, the more interesting I found it on this reread. That's definitely true in this first chapter.
Yeah.
Like seeing Buddha, seeing Doraemon. Yeah, what do you think?
I was thinking about it, and this first chapter was the chapter that blew my mind. Like this was like the book for me. But I actually found that the next chapter, 1,000 Years of Manga, was where the book was a little bit more like studying and a little bit less like learning about something, fun in an informational and fun kind of way, because I'd had so few touch points for so much of this work. Like I know the Chogiga, like the gig, because we're doing Gigatown, and I know Hokusai's work, but so much of the historical manga and like every once in a while to be like, oh, I know what Norakuro is, and then it's just like, and here's the history of Japanese political cartooning, and it's like I don't know any of this. Mishima pops up. Oh, I know Mishima, but for me it was such a hard read. But then when you get into the actual titles, there's a lot more touch points for me as someone who's even now read a lot more manga than I had when I first read this, and that was more interesting. Where I was like, oh, that's how that fits in, or oh, that's why Genius Bakabon matters, because I know who that is and I know what that manga is because it's everywhere in Japan, but I have no context for it and how it relates to history. So there's a little bit the opposite for me on that one. It was nice to see that Buddha page in Japanese, though, I gotta say. Which I guess brings us to chapter 1, history. The history of manga up to and including the war. Was there anything there that really struck out at any of you?
Well, now I appreciate it differently. Now that I have so much more context, I think when I first read this book, this was the chapter I skimmed over the fastest. Like it didn't feel as relevant to me. Like, I was like a teenager. I was like, yeah, Japanese history, right? Or this is old stuff. But then now that, like for like example, there's more books out there, like Ike Exner's book about the influence of American comic strips on the development of manga.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, I think that gives me more, more context to think about, like, because I think one of the issues he brings up is that in the Japanese perspective, and I think it's also in manga, is this kind of sense that it goes from the Choju Giga, which is that frolicking animal scroll, to Hokusai, and then maybe there's this Western punch stuff, and then voila, there's Tezuka, like boom,
Yeah.
like, and then his contention is like, no, actually, these Western comic strips came and were translated into Japanese in newspapers and had word balloons and had sequential storytelling that influenced manga. And I went to the Kyoto Manga Museum, and they don't acknowledge that very much either.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like looking at this now, it's like I still think it's interesting, but the level to which Japan takes such great pride in developing manga as this amazing art form, and not always wanting to acknowledge the fact that I tell my students, manga isn't like Galapagos turtles, right?
Yeah.
It's not like it went. There's these turtles, they're on an island, and they just evolved, to be this special breed of turtle. It's like, no, and manga was developed by being aware of comics traditions from all over the world and going back and forth, right? In being French artists seeing manga and then reflecting it back to them and back and forth. And American, like, manga artists getting Donald Duck comics from GIs and getting influenced by that. Or Monkey Punch reading Mort Drucker in Mad comics and getting influenced by that. And then people getting influenced by Monkey Punch, and then back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah,
So,
my artist on Batman, Jorge Jimenez, is very manga influenced. Like you can definitely tell like that he's picked up a lot from kind of Japanese comics for sure. Yeah, there's always that back and forth. I didn't realize how much until reading this, like that there was kind of the European influence of cartooning, but yeah, it's interesting.
I think there was not always, but like there was a long-term European arts influence in Japan as well. Like Van Gogh is very big there, for instance, and a few other artists. And I think that probably plays into it too.
And Van Gogh is influenced by Japanese stuff too, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was like a whole art trend. Yeah. It's good because, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of how to say this that isn't stupid. It's easy to think of America and individual countries as like, islands. Like we have our own culture, it's our own thing, it's just us. But like Deb was saying, like there's so much trade going on. Like Otomo and Mobius were friends and would trade drawings. And like that's such a ludicrous thing to think. Spielberg and Scorsese probably do like hang out sometimes. But it's like that level of collaboration across cultures. So they're both kind of improving each other's art just by exposure.
Well, it's like the Spielberg Scorsese thing. Like Scorsese, Spielberg, Lucas, and Coppola like would screen their movies for each other to get notes.
Yeah,
like there was a lot of that going on. Like it's weird to think of, but like George Lucas like screened like episode 1 of Star Wars to Spielberg and Coppola. Like what?
Yeah.
Like what were Coppola's notes on Jar Jar Binks? But I mean it's a healthy way to do things, especially once you go outside your circle to make it a bit more fresh. Like those guys are all kind of similar, but it's cool.
It's daunting.
It's daunting, yeah. It's weird. It's weird to think of just like kind of fans of each other and like sending each other fan letters, but
yeah.
I mean, I think that's what artists do. We're looking for fresh inspiration, and the best artists don't just copy something. They take what they think is interesting and they incorporate it into their own work.
Mm-hmm.
And so this world community of comics where people are all loving this visual storytelling and how they're all learning from each other. It's kind of leading to this weird, like right now I'm dealing with how do you recognize great manga in English when a lot of manga that's being published in English isn't necessarily first published in Japanese or isn't by native people who are ethnically, like grew up in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that? Or how do you deal with like some of the popular comics, some of the stuff that's being made into anime now are originally from stories from Korea. like now the differences are kind of getting harder and harder to tell.
And people are caring less and less, I think.
Yeah.
I just got back from Angoulême, the Angoulême Festival, which, yeah, it's fully internationalized now. I think there's obviously still room. It was always sort of a melting pot of things coming from Europe, but there was a big Canadian exhibition. There was another couple of great Japanese exhibitions, but lots of cartoonists from around the world. A big Taiwanese pavilion. I met some guys from the Philippines actually who are hosting a comic convention, and there's just like a lot of stuff happening in comics where people are sharing with one another, developing their own industries as well. And I think manga, the success of manga and the money that brings in is the bridge for that, actually. So it's like if a publisher's, got the Dragon Ball license in, Taiwan, they can actually afford to publish some original comic as well because Dragon Ball sells so well, or whatever that comic is for that market. And I think that's fascinating, something I've been seeing. But I do like that you guys brought up being surprised at the European influence on early Japanese cartooning, because honestly, there's a lot of pushback to that in Japan. I know that Ryan Holmberg, he wrote these 2 really great essays, I'll link them in the show notes, about Tezuka's big breakthrough work, which is called New Treasure Island, Shin Takarajima. And it's actually by Tezuka and his, I guess, editor or mentor, Sakai Shichima. And even that, his name got scrubbed off of the version that Tezuka redid. That was the only one for later, because the myth of the independent genius has to remain. And I think that's one of the things that is maybe overlooked in this book, is that, it wasn't just Tezuka. There were a lot of other people working on a lot of other stuff around him and with him. And while he was the most successful, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. But that scholarship where it's like, actually, this guy was really hugely influential. His editor was hugely influential and drew a bunch of these page layouts. And also he copied a whole sequence from a Mickey Mouse comic and no one commented on it for 70 years. It's really interesting discoveries that have happened since this book is written. So as much as the history is like pretty good and pretty factual, we're always learning new things as comic book researchers and critics and a society. And I think that, yeah, it would benefit a little bit more, an updated version or an updated book, something like that.
There's something about Fred Schodt that we need to mention, is that how did he get all this access to all this stuff, right? And how did he write this book and things? One is he was a translator for Tezuka, right? Like he accompanied Tezuka on a lot of his overseas trips. Like he was a good friend of Tezuka. Like, so he had, as we know, Tezuka's stature is such that if you know Tezuka and Tezuka can vouch for you, you can get some incredible access.
Yeah.
And the whole concept of writing a book like this, at the time, like there was no overseas manga market to the scale that it is today. No infrastructure in place for licensing image, content. So like this book is like incredible in the sheer vast, like the spectrum of talent he's got in here. But you can definitely tell that he gives Tezuka a lot of credit.
Oh, absolutely. In the shonen and shoujo sections in particular, all of the writing that's about Tezuka and his pals is very like kind of jovial almost, and it's filled with anecdotes about them. All the writing that's about, and there's a lot of writing about people that are outside of sort of the Tezuka circle, like coming from the Gekiga world or what we call the 49ers now, that next generation of female cartoonists and things like that sort of pushed aside the Tezuka stuff and went and did their own thing, is all it feels like research as opposed to, instead of being at the bar with Tezuka and he's telling stories, being at the drawing table with Tezuka and he's telling stories about how things were in the old days. And I think that's another really interesting tonal shift. How about, and there's so much to talk about in the shonen and shoujo sections, because I think they're a lot closer to our own experience. How did you guys feel about anything in those?
I kept thinking about how shonen, and I assume shoujo, has become very formulaic in the years since. There's kind of cookie cutter series that don't really live up to the novelty that he's expressing in the book. Like, the wide variety of sports comics, the wide variety of other kinds of comics. And that's something, I don't know if you could update the book to say and now ripoffs are popular. but it does feel like another another example of like the changing manga industry. Like the general format of like encouraging children to be better people and like go outside and do stuff is still there, but like the machinery behind it is also like, and let's see if we can make $1 billion off an anime based on these characters too.
Yeah, the post-war kind of commercialization definitely breeds kind of some homogeny there. That's the one thing I noticed, like in the early chapters of this book, like just the wide variety of art. Like not a lot of it was necessarily great, but like they were trying different things, and there were so many kind of distinct illustrative styles, even kind of more so than what was happening in North America, kind of pre-war as well, which kind of had its own kind of homogenous kind of vibe, like kind of magazine illustration stuff. So yeah, I was surprised at like how diverse and interesting the work was in the pre-World War II stuff, and then you could see after World War II, it's like, okay, all right, people are trying to kind of get locked in a little bit here, and because that's capitalism. What sells, what can you copy? Like there's a kind of a legendary story about a North American comics creator. I won't name them, but very popular. And someone asked them like how that happens, like how did you become super popular and stuff, and they were basically like, oh, I looked at this artist, this artist, this artist, this artist, and I took all the things from each artist that I found to be like really cool and really sellable, and I kind of put them together into one style. And like oh, the way this artist does eyebrows, okay, I'm taking that. The way this artist does like stubble, okay. The way this artist does anatomy, okay, and like kind of created a style that's extremely marketable. That's the downside to commercial art, which kind of on one level comics is.
In the last section, he goes really hard on that too. The future section, he's just like, and if there's a popular rom-com, everyone's got that same kind of style of rom-com in the next volume. And, they're ruining comics by being so whatever. And it's like, this is 1983. Like, and he's just like railing against the death of ingenuity. And it's like, I got bad news for you about 2024.
That's just business. I mean, and that's true for any type of storytelling business, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this amazing movie did this cool thing. Watch for 10 more like it to come out in the next 2 years, right?
Yeah. Like multiverse movies, basically.
Yeah.
Until people chewing the chewing gum lose its flavor and they lose interest. But they're going to chew that thing until every little bit of flavor is gone.
There's also the technological advances that kind of contribute to that as well. Like if you have like, I don't know, even talking like multiverse, like. Like a movie, like Everything Everywhere All at Once, like the certain style of filmmaking is like, oh, we can turn that into like a filter, like, or an easier way to kind of replicate that doesn't require as much work. Like there's always that next step after somebody creates something interesting is like we can make that interesting thing quicker. So everyone can do it. And you find that a lot, especially in comics, with like the way people do their backgrounds or kind of the stylistic things or the filters or to get into AI stuff, like people always find a way to copy a thing and make it quicker and more efficient.
Well, bisexual
lighting is like that.
Bisexual lighting
is like that, actually.
Yeah.
No, what is that? What is that?
It's like a specific kind of lighting that's like purple and bluish, heavy tones. You can see it in movies like Moonlight, and I think John Wick 2 was another example.
Drive 2, right?
Yeah, Drive was pretty close. And it's what it actually is being artful about your light choices and like how it reflects off skin and that kind of thing. But what people mostly took from it was like make it kind of purple.
Well, I mean the lighting thing's interesting because like Michael Bay movies, like they were kind of the first ones to have that interesting like kind of cool to warm tone gradient in them, and
orange.
like that blue orange thing, and like Lord knows my illustrations copied that a lot back in like the early 2000s, but it became a button, I think, like for people. Like you press a button and it just has that filter, whereas he was doing it with actual lenses and stuff. Now it became a post-production thing, like, oh, the Michael Bay filter, sure.
Yeah. But that's true of everything, right? Like a lot of the textures in manga were originally just hand-drawn, and then they became screen tone, right?
Yeah.
I'm looking at page 82, the baseball manga one, those really dynamic speed lines.
Oh yeah.
And the beautifully hand-drawn sound effects. Like, and then one of the things that comes up when I deal with people who want to draw manga style is they overdo it with the speed line stuff.
Yeah. That's
because we don't have them here. It's like it's every Western cartoonist I know who goes to Tokyo goes to the same store to buy a bunch of Zipatone. You know, like there was like a gray market screen tone importing like pipeline for a while. And I think it's because since we don't have it here, everyone's like, oh, I want to use it, but we don't have like the time to get like really good at using it or really sensitive.
Yeah.
There was one Jose artist we read who used it really well, and I can't remember her name now. Maybe River's Edge, Kyoko Okazaki.
Oh yeah, she does really interesting things with it.
Yeah.
Like blobby kind of. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
I mean, the program I use to draw comics, Clip Studio, like, there are so many speed line variations that you can do in that, and focus line kind of bursts, and I can see how it can become addictive, and just like, I'm just gonna put on everything. Everything's fast. Everything's unbelievable. The baseball thing on page 82, I found really interesting because there's a few mentions in here about like kind of influence on cinema, on the storytelling, and that feels specific to film and photography, because like the only way you can kind of like get the idea of like the distended moving object is through film and photography, like a freeze frame on something. Like if you freeze frame.
Why might you want to learn a new language? For some of us on Mangasplaining, we use our knowledge of Japanese on the podcast to compare the English editions of manga to the Japanese. And honestly, reading more manga natively in Japanese, or bande dessinée in French, or webtoons in Korean, it's definitely a dream, and a great way to get there might be Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone is a trusted language learning program available on desktop or as an app, and it truly immerses you in the language you want to learn. Rosetta Stone has been a trusted expert in language learning for 30 years, with millions of users and 25 languages offered. Rosetta Stone offers fast language acquisition, immersing you in a language with no English translations, an intuitive process, and it's designed for long-term retention. It uses true accent technology to give you feedback on your pronunciation, and it's convenient with desktop and smartphone app options for offline learning. It's also an amazing value, so don't put off learning that language. There's no better time than right now to get started. For a very limited time, Mangasplaining learners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership for 50% off. Visit rosettastone.com today. That's 50% off unlimited access to 25 language courses for the rest of your life. Redeem your 50% off at rosettastone.com/today today.
Anything moving fast, it's distended. And seeing that here, and obviously in a lot of the manga we've read, just kind of reminded me like, oh yeah, like there's so much influence from film cinema into comics. The translation of motion into still images.
Page 83, it's like that, like moment by moment of the pitching action, right? It's like a Moy Bridge kind of thing.
Yeah.
I always grew up associating that effect with Spider-Man because it was where I first saw it in Spider-Man comics.
Oh yeah.
He'd leap around the panel, and there's like several.
Yeah.
And what I love about this is that not only are there like 7 drawings of hands, but there's also like a really anatomical muscle, like the anatomical drawing of his shoulder to get across exactly what's happening. It's just a really cool page executed in a way that I don't think anyone would do it nowadays.
No.
No one would have the time.
No one have the time, because that's not a thing that you can do with the click of a button. That's the thing you actually have to be like, okay, I got to go through it step by step. While we're in the vicinity of these pages, I was really interested in. They talk about that. I think page 85 shows it, the boxing manga.
Oh yeah.
And the long. I mean, I didn't know about this boxing manga, and the fact that like the guy kind of dies quietly.
Yeah.
Sitting ringside after the fight.
This is the one I keep trying to get Christopher and Deb to publish.
It's Ashita no Joe, by the way, for anyone who's wondering.
Ashita no Joe, okay.
So that last scene of Ashita no Joe where he's basically just like slumped at ringside, and it's great. He just has a slight smile on his face, but it's kind of grayed out. That is a meme, and I've seen so many webtoons now. There's going to be a scene where a person's just resigned, like, oh, I give up, or like, oh, that's the last straw. They mimic that Ashita no Joe scene. I have a whole folder of clips of this because it's just like, oh my god, but because this is not available in English, it's the anime is. But it's such an iconic manga. And I think one of the things that comes up for me with this is that this introduces us to a lot of manga that will probably never be published in English.
Yeah, right.
Which is so frustrating because it's because it's old and it's long series, and generally speaking, with a few handful of exceptions, we don't get most manga published before 1990. No matter how influential they are. But I love that, like this. I come back to this book every now and then and go, "Oh, Gege Natara got published. Oh, Rosa Versailles got published." But we all know this, even the sampling of these things, thanks to this book.
Yeah.
Well, one other thing I was going to say about the boxing scene is I like they mentioned here in the book just like the fact that like a lot of these kinds of series end with the character dying, like multiple series and then their death, and it's such a different feel from North American comics. And also we don't really experience it that much on Mangasplaining because we're reading usually the first volume of a thing. We don't see the ending that results in maybe not necessarily the happily ever after, especially with stuff like here. Like they talk a lot about sports manga in this book, and even I guess the work manga, the explainer manga, that like there's so much to gain about devoting your all to a subject, and that is the reward of putting in the work to a thing, and death is not a sad thing at the end necessarily.
Yeah,
because you have done it, which is a very different take than maybe the North American kind of happily ever after style ending.
Yeah. I love the ending of Ashita no Joe. To the point, I was actually surprised they didn't put it in the book. Like Deb was mentioning, it's very iconic and all over. Like, and then they choose a cross counter, which is a great like iconic Ashita no Joe thing. But it's such a good book, and one day Chris and Deb will give it to me. But
one day we'll page 84. But I will say, like, what blew me away about Ashita no Joe is that photo above it. The fact that when the character died, they had a funeral for it. Like, whoa, what?
Yeah, that's wild.
I mean, you get stuff like that in North America as well. Like Spider-Man and Mary Jane Watson got married at a baseball game.
Yeah.
They did. I remember that.
They did.
I was thinking during this, there's a bunch of parallels between like American and Japanese comics. Like not exact parallels, but like, there was the big funeral for Rikishi from Ashita no Joe. There was the marriage of Spider-Man and Mary Jane. There was the era of fans of manga coming to become manga artists, and like how that changes things a little bit. And like that's the Roy Thomas era for American people.
Yeah.
Or American industry. I know it's a really interesting book, even like with the outdatedness of it, because there's so much in here that, like Deb was saying, we'll never see. Like the Tiger Mask comic on page 84.
Yeah.
Which is probably my favorite drawing in the book of Tiger Mask drop kicking a guy into a nail-studded cross. Like there's just so much where it'd be interesting, but who would you sell this to? Like 150 people,
Yeah.
Just us. It's just doing Mangasplaining.
It's such a shame, but on the bright side, there are some real boutique publishers publishing older stuff in English. Like I think, anyways, it's this slim little volume of Yakuza manga about badass babes. Badass tattooed Yakuza babes.
I should check that out.
That's an easy sell, though.
Yeah.
It's not much of a stretch there. I can't believe they managed to publish this ancient manga about badass Yakuza babes.
Clearly, I've just sold 2 copies.
Yeah.
But there's even stuff like Saze-chan.
Saze-san, yeah.
Saze-san. I called it like the little Lulu of Japanese comics, where she's just kind of like rambunctious but like good-hearted. And seeing that in here was really cool because I found bilingual editions as an adult, and I was like, "Oh, I can finally check out this thing that I saw once in a book in 1997."
Yeah, it's kind of like the mix between like For Better or Worse, like Lynn Johnson, and Little Lulu. But the fact that like she drew that as a newspaper strip and continued till she retired. It's kind of amazing.
Like one of the big first post-war hits. Like, yeah, it's crazy. In the same way that Blondie's still in the newspaper today, it's just on its like 10th artist or whatever, or probably 4th or 5th. But Sazai-san, like she drew it until she retired in the 60s, and it still remains. There's still Sazai-san stores all over Tokyo, and like
the anime
pop-ups
still
and things
runs.
like that.
It's actually one of the longest running anime series. Period.
Wow.
But it's not in English because it's so Japanese.
Yeah, she has a museum in Tokyo that's kind of all about. When I went, I didn't get to visit last time I went there, but the latest exhibit was all the art that she saw on her trips around the world as like a working artist, which is kind of cool, you know?
Yeah. Like, oh, I saw that thing at the Louvre. Have the Louvre send it to Tokyo.
Yeah. One thing that's really threaded through this book that I kind of liked is seeing the esteem that some manga artists or their series or their magazines or whatever kind of grew to enjoy over the course of their work. And like all through hard work. Like there wasn't really like a huge marketing apparatus back then. Like times were really different. Like you had to sit down and really, really draw to win. And, you know, Sanpei Shirato's in here. We still have barely any of his stuff in. Actually, he's out of print in English right now. I've been buying old back issues.
But Drowning Quarterly is publishing them in Legend of Kamui.
Later
they just
year,
announced they're going to do Kamui, the whole Kamui gun, which is going to be
that's so huge.
Definitely one we'll cover. Yeah, I think so.
That's ninjas.
Yeah,
that's the ninja comic. I'm so excited about that one. This was basically the most frustrating little book sometimes, right? Because it would give you a taste of something, make it sound awesome, and say, "Too bad, that's it. That's all you're gonna get is that little taste." It's like when you go to a fancy restaurant and you get that little amuse-bouche, and you go, "I could eat 10 of that shit." But no, that's it. All you got is that one little taste.
Yep.
That was a weird metaphor.
No, it's good.
It worked. Yeah. I think that you and food metaphors are like a Mangasplaining staple at this point.
So we kind of covered shonen, shoujo. We talked a little bit about explainer manga. I'm curious what you guys think of the regulation section, where it talks about hyper-violent comics and erotic comics and things like that. Because we haven't, I think one of the things that we've experienced with seinen manga and josei manga, which may or may not actually exist depending on who you talk to, is that the sort of outre, like the gekiga, the like hardcore violence and things like that, or the like sex and the like, you know, real lives of ladies stuff that was only in sort of more pornographic works, let's say, has seeped into the medium. I know that a lot of seinen manga we've read has been very, very violent. A lot of josei books that we've read have been very sexual and have, you know, showed boobs or wieners or what have you. I'm curious if this section still felt relevant to you. Did you feel like you learned anything about 1980s and 70s censorship effects on comics in Japan?
I didn't really know that there was any kind of regulation. Like the only regulation that we've really kind of discussed is the lack of phalluses.
And that's in this chapter.
Yeah. One of the interesting things from this that I learned was that it spawned because you could not have like adult penises, but you could have kid penises. So it created some really probably horrific comics where it was like kids in sexual situations because they couldn't show adults in sexual situations, which is wild to me. I was kind of fascinated by kind of the humor angle to most of this work, especially like in the 70s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like they all seem kind of really kind of funny, gross.
Yeah.
Which I appreciate. I kind of want more of in the world. I'm very upset. Like you talk about, you know, getting the tasters for things and then, you know, not seeing more of it. Just even the mention of Professor Toilet and the paragraph or two on No Good Daddy. I'm just like, I want these books in my life. But whatever that other one, that kid cop who's like, I sentenced you to death. Like, I want to read that. The interesting thing to me is just like how absurd all these ideas seem to be, which kind of makes it feel like you can get away with it more than if it was kind of realistic.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me as well. It's the Good Place unintended consequences effect of like, oh, we're gonna ban pubic hair, and it's like, great, we'll have nudity where characters don't have pubic hair. Who doesn't have pubic hair? It's like, guys, you messed up. You done messed up. Stop persecuting gay people. Let them exist and have art, but you've created this other problem. And it's Yeah, it's one of the things that is the most difficult about digging into manga and going to, especially, this is one of the things I want to talk about in terms of we passed all the comic stuff. It doesn't talk about doujinshi at all. There's no mention of comic market, indie comics.
There's very little mention. There's very little mention of it. They do talk, I think, at some point about like thousands of other comics, but like.
But it was relatively new that at the time, right? Because Comic only kind of came into being in like the late 70s.
Yeah, but it was one of the things. It came out of Com, which he mentions, but it doesn't mention like this huge like fan created work situation. And I get like that, like for example, June magazine that they spent some time talking about, like they don't even have the words BL yet or yaoi or anything. They're just like homosexual comics in which men and men engage each other. It's like, yeah, sure, that's like a fine 1983 description, I guess, but they don't have BL as a name. But they don't mention that it came very firmly out of the fan base. Like it's not just like a bunch of ladies decided that this is what people liked. It's like a bunch of ladies were, watching French films and being like, I'll draw a comic about that. And it turned into a whole massive part of the industry that is just almost not touched on here. And it comes out of fan comics. And I thought that was the thing, maybe in terms of regulation, in terms of talking about the comics that were there, and in terms of the industry, that like the fans and it started, and it's like, yeah, these people work in high school and then they go get jobs at magazines. And it's like, no, there's another step in between there that's actually a really big deal these days that I think would have been tremendously inspiring to young me, reading this book and going, I like to draw and I make mini comics, but I'm not good enough to go get a job at a magazine. Guess I'm boned. Like there's no way forward for me, it seemed like. And I think that a section on that would have really gone far.
Yeah.
This as a window into the world of manga, and that not being there meant that when I was finally introduced to that world, Comic and doujinshi and all this stuff, it was a mind blower for me. Like, wait, what?
Oh yeah,
I thought I knew all this stuff. It's like, and then seeing the scale of it and seeing how it, like the conversations I'd had with when I think I went to the Yonezawa Museum Library, which is like the archives of the guy who founded Comic, and finding out the scale of the show, how they had archived all the, like everyone who exhibits at Comic, has to give a copy of their book to the committee, and it's cataloged in boxes by date, like all this kind of stuff.
Also, the porn comics they sell there.
Yes, everything.
Wild.
What, like imagine like if like at every San Diego Comic-Con, San Diego International went to every table and said, I want one copy of each of your books
for free,
and for free, and it's going to be part of an archive.
Yeah.
I mean, to that
so
level,
they actually do that for SPX, but it's voluntary for the Library of Congress. Actually, it's one of the great things that only SPX does, as far as I know, in North America, is they work with the Library of Congress to build sort of an archive of comics exhibited at SPX. And if you exhibit there, you're always welcome to donate a book to show. I think they only want American creators, so I don't think I've ever donated anything. I've exhibited at SPX a few times, but yeah, Comiket, his library and the library that they've established is one of those things where if they ever get that building built that they want to expand that library and have he's just got warehouses. He had 4 warehouses full of stuff that he had bought from the 1970s as a fan. Gives Eric Koh a good run for his money, if you know who that is. And just collected stuff. And they're just this could be the greatest pop culture museum, Japanese pop culture museum in the world. This could be the best. This could be amazing. And they're just not sure what to do with it because it's the permissions alone to go to all these individual companies and say, can we put your, plastic spaceship that you made in 1974 in a display case is very difficult, actually.
Yeah.
I think this one chapter about the violence and the sex and stuff like that, that was the most eye-popping chapter I remember when I first read it. And then I'm looking at it now and it's like page 128 where guy's eyeballs are not just popping out, they're spiraling out of his head, right? What? That's crazy inventive. That's just nuts. Or the part where the penis contest, penis can, on page 131 where it's holding up a basket of rocks.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we've all been there.
Yeah. It's coming of age ceremony, very common.
Yeah.
And like now I'm numb to this, right? Because I'm seeing all kinds of stuff in manga, but at the time, I had never seen anything like that in comics before. My mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This chapter felt dangerous as a kid, mostly because if my mom ever found it, I would have been in huge trouble.
Yeah.
This.
Chip, did you have any impressions of this chapter?
I mean, I'm a grown man reading it now, so I don't feel like I'd get in trouble for my mommy.
True. You never know.
You never know. I mean, it's we've kind of covered a lot of this kind of on Mangasplaining, obviously. We've done like Devil Man and talked a lot about kind of the impact of that at the time, and a lot of the more erotic fare.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I read this more just kind of like a matter of fact thing than a shocking thing, because I'm coming to it from my deep knowledge of manga at this point.
Nice.
So let's talk about the industry section then.
Wait, I have a controversial question before we go.
Ooh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think at this point Chip has read more manga than Fred Schodt and his collaborators had at the time they wrote this book?
No.
Yikes.
Unfortunately. More different manga, maybe, but definitely not more.
Okay.
That dude had read most of Tezuka when he started writing this book, and that's 300 volumes right there.
I'll give you an aside. So on my Facebook, I've been saying, I had to buy a lot of how to draw manga research books for my class, and it's more than my paycheck. Fred Schodt replied to my Facebook post and said, "Oh, what a shame. I had so much manga that I end up giving to the Berkeley Library. I should have gave them to you." I shrieked inside.
Those are always the worst messages to get, that I should have. Oh, I did the thing you would have really liked, but instead I did it in another way. Oh, well. Like, come on.
Oh, man.
Oh, it's a shame. It's a shame you're broke this month. I had so much money and I just gave it away to someone else. Oh, well.
I'll say, I am very fortunate to have met Fred several times. I don't think we're super palsies, but he lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the times when I have met him, I've always told him, you and Candy are why I'm in where I am in this strange and wonderful position of having more comics than a retirement fund.
How old is he now?
He's late 70s, maybe?
Okay.
I'm not sure. He's got to be older than that, because he was in his maybe 20s, at least.
He was in university in 1970.
I mean, yeah, Mangasplaining should collaborate with him and do manga.
3 mangas?
Manga.
I also have to interject the part about why the book hasn't been updated, despite many people saying he should. Getting permissions for all this art is impossible now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. A book that has 4 single chapters from 4 different... Yeah. Oh, my God, yeah. Unless they were all indie stuff, it's not... these companies don't want to work together at all.
No.
As creators maybe even don't either. Oh, Frederik Schodt, by the way, is 74.
Oh, there you go.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, at this point, you probably wouldn't publish this with the comics in the back, I don't think, anyways. Because that was such a, oh my God, look at this, manga. You can read manga here in North America. That kind of vibe is done with. And yeah, I guess you could reprint this and flesh it out, but just the examples would have to all be different. All the historical stuff works fine. Yeah.
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 I think it as a book, as a moment in time, I think it's good as it is.
Yeah.
But I think the reason why I picked the British Museum book is that it's the next best thing.
Yeah.
In terms of it has whole chapters of manga, talks about the business, and has interviews with different people. It's really an exhaustive book.
Maybe we could do it then. Deb, is that your first pick for season 5 is going to be the British Museum manga book, another 400 pages of text for Chip to read?
Oh, you son of a bitch.
And also my students are so angry at me for that one, because they say it's expensive and it's hard to find. I'm like, look, kids, this is all I got.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. We're running a little bit long. I want to talk about the comic still. So any final thoughts on at least the first half of this book, 3/4 of this book, the text, anything that we didn't get to, anything that you want to mention?
I was mostly fascinated by just that period of right after World War II, like the kind of explosion out of that, especially with like the female artists kind of getting the vote and like having more independence, kind of creating their manga. Also, just the idea of like the samurai comics and the sports comics being in place of war comics, which is like such an American thing, but still getting across that same vibe of like, you know, teams working together and like battle and honor and things like that. There was one thing I remember jumped out at me. I forget the name of the comic, but it was about like a judo master, and it was like 1952. And like one of his big move was the atom bomb throw. And I'm like, in 1952, like that blew my mind. Like part of me was just like, is that a mistranslation, or was was the Japanese society just like weirdly integrating kind of parts of their trauma into these comics, like as entertainment? Like it was a very strange section to read. Like obviously there's like kind of atomic age stuff when you get into Astro Boy and things like that, but like but yeah, something that direct was like, oof, man.
There's a lot
wild
that is there, but the quickest answer I can give you is Godzilla had atomic fire breath.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a post-war character that is about the war, but also about rebuilding and about a lot of other things. But yeah, better people than I have written extensively on that subject.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can find any of them for the show notes.
I'm kind of amazed too. Like they talk about like, I guess the Allied occupation weirdly being kind of a period of freedom.
It was
for some of the artists. That's kind of wild to me. I usually kind of feel like that would be the opposite, but I guess because of the nationalism and stuff before World War II, that it's like, oh, okay, like they're no longer clamping down on us, which was that was kind of wild.
Well, yeah, because it was imperialistic, right?
Yeah, that period is really interesting, and I didn't actually realize that like it's illegal for Japan to go to war, like that it's like baked into their constitution at that point, like never again. Which that's
still
fascinating.
Is.
Yeah, I know.
Which is the whole thing.
Yeah.
If you've got access to a copy of Yoshihiro Tatsumi's A Drifting Life, published by Drawn and Quarterly, it's currently, I want to say, between printings rather than out of print. I hope it's not out of print, but it's between printings. But it covers basically him living in Osaka during the Kashiban, like the rental market period, becoming a young person who makes comics and then moving and getting to see the aftermath of what Tokyo was like after the war and the rebuilding and the student movement and stuff like that. It's a really, really good book. It's one of the rare autobiographies in comics. Later volumes of Barefoot Gen deal with this a little bit more as well, the rebuilding period and food shortages and things like that. And the sort of, there was like almost no government for a little while there. And they kind of, clamp back down again in the late 50s and 60s. But there's some good manga out there about it. I'll see if I can think of anything else and throw them in the show notes.
Cool.
So let's end up this section of the podcast with this quote, which is from The Future, which is the last chapter of the text portion of Manga from Mr. Frederik Schodt. First Japan, then the world? American comics have been distributed around the world, often in translation. Superman alone sells in over 45 nations. Japan's comics industry today dwarfs that of any other country. Will Japanese comics now follow Toyota's and Sony's overseas? The obstacles they face are formidable. The same cultural isolation that has helped Japan develop such a rich comic culture is also a factor in limiting the ability of people in other nations to understand and enjoy them. I think that's a hell of a quote in 1983. And us sitting here on the Mangasplaining podcast in 2024, I think that's pretty fun. So we'll leave that there. All right, let's talk about some comics. There are 4 comics in the back of Manga, The World of Japanese Comics by Frederik Schodt. These were among the first comics translated into and published in English when they came out originally in 1983 in that hardcover book. Those comics are Phoenix by an excerpt. These are all excerpts, by the way. These are from larger works. These comics are Osamu Tezuka's Phoenix, Leiji Matsumoto's Ghost Warrior, Ryoko Ikeda's The Rose of Versailles, and Keiji Nakazawa's Barefoot Gen. I'm a little proud that we've read 2 of those books. The third one is not available in English, and the fourth one is a huge oversight that I will be correcting shortly, Barefoot Gen. So Yeah, let's start at the beginning. What did everyone think of Osamu Tezuka's Phoenix? Knowing full well that we've had an episode on Osamu Tezuka's Phoenix.
It was okay.
Is all right?
No, I am against any comic where a turtle gets its head cut off.
Fair point. Content warning on this
but
one.
The drawings were good. It's a Tezuka comic. You kind of Tezuka Phoenix, especially. You kind of know what to expect, and this is.
No, but you didn't in 1983.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's gorgeous, and like, it's funny. I'm looking at it through a different lens because I've been looking at some Karl Barks lately.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
because one of those big YouTubers posted a video that just kind of about Karl Barks' history, and like their connections to Tezuka in terms of like their storytelling. I can see it here. Like there's like, oh, okay, all right, they were kind of on the same wavelength.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really beautiful stuff. Like even if some of it feels a little dated, it's like, oh no, the storytelling's amazing.
The stuff with the ship rocking on the waves was really good.
Yeah,
the underwater hallucination part where it goes kind of Starlin-y is also good.
Starlin-y. Yeah, it's amazing.
I think this was one of the ones that was not flipped. I'm gonna have to double check this against copies of Phoenix. I think this is one of the ones that was cut and pasted to read in a Western orientation rather than Eastern one. He talks in the introduction about how some of the books were mirror flipped and some of the books are cut and pasted, and this is mostly right angle panels. So I think this is one of the ones that was probably printed the way that Tezuka had originally intended, give or take. So I think that's pretty interesting. I actually am shocked that there was such a easily compartmentalized story in Phoenix that you could print and give people the idea of like what Phoenix, like you could read this and be like, oh, that was Phoenix. It was a 20-page story. It's like, no, it's 14 volumes of Phoenix, 12 volumes, sorry, of Phoenix, and so much more actually as well. So yeah, I thought that was actually really good. If this is your first Tezuka in 1983, you're like, oh, okay, this guy's got some chops. We're all right here. So I like that.
Yeah, in terms of being different from like the American fare that was on offer at the time, I think this would have been mind-blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Just the religious aspects alone, like these beautiful illustrations of like Buddhist art that are redone by Tezuka and his team, I think are pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. All right, next up, Leiji, anglicized as Reiji Matsumoto with Ghost Warrior. This one, I've been hearing for a long time about how it was a shame that none of Leiji Matsumoto's war comics were translated, and this helped explain why. The depictions of indigenous peoples in this are not as bad as they could be, but that is not saying a lot, actually. I've seen way worse in manga than this, and it is not good.
I've seen way worse in this book.
Yeah, way worse in this book. Yeah, but also I thought it was kind of a really good gotcha kind of a story about the folly of war, too. It's unfortunate the depictions are pretty ignorant. I mean, it's also looking back at 1980, looking back at 1960, like, I don't know what I'm going to do about it, right? But
but like on 202, it says, I thought only the evil white colonialists had sex with the local natives. Like, nope, we're all the same.
Yeah, there's like an edge to it.
What a nice message. We're all the same.
It does feel naively offensive instead of like, I hate these specific people, I'm going to make them look like racial caricatures, you know?
And there is that kind of that, semi twist at the end where he's like, he says America's strong, so they're our allies, like just kind of playing them the way they played the people before.
Yeah.
And then just finally actually being like, yeah, don't worry, someday we'll be independent. Like, you got to be patient here. Like, these assholes are the ones kind of killing each other.
I do like that it's not Harlock or 3-9 or Esmeralda for Matsumoto. Like, they chose something really out of left field for this guy.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we've read any Matsumoto on the podcast, have we?
We haven't. We've referenced him an awful lot, but we haven't read anything yet.
He's mostly, like, if you mention Leiji Matsumoto, people go sci-fi, like Trains in Space, Space Pirates, like cool space pirate queens and that kind of thing. So this is like left field Matsumoto for American readers in the same way that, say, Bunny Hugh Laurie is left field for like American viewers.
True.
Yeah. But I did enjoy this story. Like, it is definitely some old-timey stuff. But like, the drawings are cool. The plane stuff is really interesting. ambivalence towards the military was pretty good.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, Matsumoto, he's such an interesting artist, and he looks so strange. All of his characters, like he's like a constellation of characters, like Tezuka does.
I would say the lettering is bothering me a little bit, though.
Really?
It's very square. There's something I can't quite place about it.
Like it
I
doesn't.
mean,
Like on page
yeah.
2 and 2, it's like the "aye" and the "help." Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think it's supposed to be. I mean, it's not really professional lettering because they probably just translated it just for this, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
probably just called in some favors, like, hey, can you can you do this?
Who knows how to use an Ames guide? Because you can really see how like rigid
Yeah.
everything, all the lines are and things like that. But I actually thought that was really interesting to get like a hand look at it, because we've been reading everything and everything has so much computer lettering these days. And it was like,
Mm.
it's
Yeah.
it's naive in the same way that some of the art feels a little bit naive to me.
Oh.
Like he simplifies in cartoons in a way that's wildly inconsistent. Like you couldn't animate this. It has I think we talked about it maybe 20 episodes ago. It has the Sailor Moon problem where he draws in such a way that you can't do a 3D turnaround of any of these characters because they're just like smushing all of the time in every panel.
Yeah.
And like the lettering being a little bit off actually really feels nice. It all feels like it's just like the same hand kind of did it all.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I think that's nice. Calling Leiji Matsumoto a naive artist is, I'm gonna get killed for it. But at the same time, like it's a little bit like people who come into the comics industry late going, why does everyone like this Jack Kirby guy? His work looks so old. It's the same thing. It's like, no, he's a genius and you gotta get on board and you gotta learn.
I do appreciate that you get that, right? Like you get this perspective of the like Japanese war comics are so different than American war comics.
Yeah,
Even though
really, really
the
different.
ones that they were created by, like Kirby was a war vet, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is almost more like a modern war comic, like something like a Garth Ennis one shot kind of.
Yeah, totally.
The Shot talks a little bit in the Seinen Shonen section about war comics Chip was mentioning, and the one he specifically references has the title in English, Onwards Towards Our Noble Death, which he's just has the Japanese title in this because it obviously hadn't been translated 20 years later. Jocelyn translated it, and Jocelyn Allen, friend of the podcast. And it's about the idea that like your death is noble and you're going to be sent back to war. And even if you survive and you were supposed to die, well, then you better go out there and die, buddy, because we're not letting you back. It's like such a shameful thing. And I like that he talks about it, but can't get the entire graphic novel length Onwards Toward Our Noble Death into the back of this book. So he gets the same idea of these kamikaze pilots that didn't die and now are just like, well, I guess I'm on my own and I got to keep fighting until I eventually die. And then everyone does, you know what I mean? So I think that's smart on his part to reference this work and then find this other work that has these same themes that would probably be incredibly shocking to North American readers. The idea that like someone survived in the war and they were like, no, you were supposed to die, get back out there. Like, yeah, that's grotesque, actually. That's like awful. So
get back out there is the funniest possible way to
get back out there. Yeah, well. All right. Our next story is one that we've actually read before, which again, totally wild. And this particular sequence, I remember us talking a lot about in the episode. It was The Rose of Versailles by Ryoko Ikeda, published in English now by Udon Entertainment. Yeah, it was so fun to revisit this, especially after that war story, because it's like so low stakes, but also such intensity for the low stakes. It was great.
I mean, since we've read Rose of Versailles, my wife has gotten into The Gilded Age, the TV show The Gilded Age.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically set in like, I don't know, like 18 something in New York City. So it's like all about high society. It's like Downton Abbey, but in New York. But she's like, but my wife does not like stressful situations on television. Like I think I mentioned before, she can barely watch like Seinfeld. Like,
oh, wow.
So she's just like, this show's amazing because it gives you like the lowest possible stakes. I'm like, what? I sat down, I watched an episode with her, and at the end of the episode, it was like this one woman was like, oh, the Duke thinks he's going for brunch at her house. Does he? We'll see about that. Cut to credits. I'm like, what? That's not a cliffhanger. and coming back and rereading this section, I'm just like, oh, it's totally got that vibe. It's just like, oh, I have to speak to her at a public event. Oh, this
and I'm a princess, and she a lowly prostitute, and it's just like, wow. It's like
So much
literally
tension. It's
two
so
nations
great.
will go
It's
to
so
war if you don't do this. Thousands will die, tens of thousands maybe. It's just like, no, my honor. Like,
Maybe I should get Rosa Versailles for my wife. Maybe this will be her first manga.
It might be too
It's-
stressful.
Might be
It
too
might be.
stressful. Yeah.
I know
Yeah, I know
somebody
it
who
gets
can hook you
more
up. Don't worry
stressful as
about
it goes on,
that.
based on history.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a delight to revisit this. Yeah.
Hey, Deb, did the art look different to you on this than the Udon edition? Because I know the Udon edition is from like the Japanese Perfect Edition, and I know that artists would sometimes go back and redraw things or add more. There was a lot less like flowers in like panel borders and things like that than I remembered. I'd have to compare side by side, but
Yeah, it looks a lot more simplistic. I mean, I think the basics are there, but it doesn't seem to have that refinement that I'm used to seeing in her work. You know, like this refined line work and this refined backgrounds and stuff like that. I think it's pretty much the same, but it feels like this is. I think you're right. I think this is probably an earlier version, and that she later tweaked it. But Tezuka did that. Like for example, you look at this picture of 220 of that Madame du Barry. Like her face looks really strange.
yeah. Maybe I'll take some photos and I'll compare the version in here to the version that Udon published, because it does seem a little different. Like,
Yeah.
and this, I know that book, every edition of the book would have changes and updates. It was one of the things that Udon had to do, was like find stuff from old editions that weren't in the new edition so they could have the complete edition. Just one of those things that I like about the books that they do. But yeah, check the show notes for that. We'll see what's there. Ending the book off, we have Barefoot Gen, Keiji Nakazawa. What did you guys think?
It's really effective, I think. This is still, like I always joke, scare quotes joke, that where other people have had Grave of the Fireflies, I had Barefoot Gen. Because that was the harrowing World War II childhood drama that I found as a kid. But they do a great job of introducing you to the family. Nakazawa does. The aftermath of the explosion, the drawing of the flash, and then the wind is really good on page like 242, 243. Yeah, this book made a huge impression on me when I was a kid. And I still never read it all the way through, but I still really appreciate like the draftsmanship and like the scope of the story he's trying to tell.
But also too, that it was a Shonen Jump series.
Oh, it was in
that's
Jump.
wild, eh?
Yeah.
It's so wild to me, just kind of turn off my modern North American market brain. Like the fact that page 242 and 243 aren't just like two splash pages. Like the fact that like this is like the inciting incident, and it's massive, and just that flash panel. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is one of 7 panels on that page.
Yeah.
Of it going off, and like the next page with the tiles and the tearing poles is gorgeous. It's like super evocative. And obviously the page after with the sky high explosion is incredible as well. But it's interesting to me the use of space in something like this, how different it would be today if you were kind of telling the story. God, it's just horrific. I remember this is like one of the only kind of manga that I read when I was like a teenager. My friend Ben gave me a copy, and I was just like, oh, it just wrenched my heart.
Yeah, that's a good word for it.
It's just unbelievable. And it's like, but in the matter of factness of it too, like moment to moment to moment to moment, and like just having to deal with like horrendous things every couple of pages, and still able to go on. Is like, got a horse on fire. My God! Like, look at this. Like that's the splash page there, which deserves a splash page. But yeah.
It's an intense comic, and there's a really good reason why it was one of the first in English.
Yeah.
Like you could buy it as a little floppy comic book. I bought my copy at Revolutionary Books, which was a communist bookstore.
Nice.
Yeah. But like, so as an aside, Last Gas has republished I Saw It, which is this excerpt. And they also publish a book called I Can't Forget the Bomb, which is like his biography memoir. It's a really slim little volume, but he talks more intimately about his experience. real experiences and drawing the comic and stuff like that. So that's these are both interesting companions to reading the Barefoot Gen book in its series in its entirety. It's I think I mean I must commend Last Gasp, because they really put a lot of effort into keeping these books in print and making them available. I mean, they had a Kickstarter to make all these books available to libraries, to supply a free copy to libraries.
Oh.
Barefoot Gen Volume 1 was published sort of on its own as a standalone book very early. It was actually it was earlier than this, one of the very first manga published in English. And then for years, it was the only thing available before Last Gasp went and did volumes 1 to 4 in partnership with the nonprofit organization that is founded around this. And yeah, they did a 1 to 10 finally. And so all 10 volumes of Barefoot Gen are now available in English. The story does stop being about the bomb at a certain point. More becomes about the lives of the people that were affected by the bomb and how it's different than a lot of other portrayals of Japanese life that we see in the 50s and 60s. Like Gen grows up, and it's really interesting. I should give that a reread at some point. But yeah, huge shout out to Last Gasp for keeping these books in print and being available. And yeah, I regret that we haven't covered this yet on the podcast, but I think there's no digital. I'll have to double check that before I make any suggestions about that.
Did you read the interview with Raina Telgemeier?
But yeah, I was going to say, I'm back in Toronto, so it makes it a bit easier for me. Yeah, it's definitely one that I should probably own.
Yeah, it's worth reading. The interview with Raina Telgemeier that's in The Atlantic in this issue, she talks about how reading Barefoot Gen affected her.
Nice.
And how she did a mini comic about how it affected her. And she had been, for a while, had been proposing to Scholastic that would be her next book, about how reading this book affected her and, things like that. And that, later in life, she and her dad went to Hiroshima to visit the museum. That stuff. And she's very frank in the interview saying her publisher was not comfortable with her taking on such a heavy topic for young readers.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Imagine turning down Raina.
No, they just got another book out of her.
Yeah.
They made her write about something else. Or no, she had another topic in mind and she went in, I think it was guts.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it makes more sense for for her audience at the time, but yeah, it would have been pretty amazing to read.
That means I feel like we'll get that book someday.
Yeah.
I always thought that would be an amazing book, but yeah.
A book about a book is kind of fascinating, like a nonfiction, like an autobiography kind of memoir about another book. Like, yeah, you think you'd want to. Sorry, my marketing brain is just like, okay, do you put those books together? Like, do you team publishers and kind of figure out a way to get that in schools along with the.
Yeah. I think that with Reina's stature and Nakazawa's stature in Japan, you totally team up publishers.
Yeah.
I think they would find a way to make that work. I can say, though,
slam dunk.
There's been a lot of pushback against Barefoot Gen in Japan over the last decade because it's so horrific. Like, the face melting in this volume and the dead families is just part of it, honestly. There's so much that happens over the next couple of volumes that parent-teacher associations, as we learned about in this book, which have a lot of power in Manga, have been pushing back against Barefoot Gen, because it's like, kids don't need to learn about the war this way. Kids don't need to learn about the bomb. It's in the past. And it's just, it is shocking to me. Like, it is, I cannot believe that this is a real thing that's happening in Japan, that it's like, this is a book that only adults should read. It's like, no, this is a book that was written for kids, that ran in Shonen Jump. And it's really important, actually. And kids should read it and know why militarism is bad. And it's, So,
I mean, a willful ignorance.
I'm not surprised that
history.
Scholastic's pushing back against Reina doing a book about it, because in Japan, parent-teacher groups are saying, no, this subject isn't appropriate for kids in Japan. It's like, it happened to kids in Japan. It's about a kid in Japan. It's autobiographical. Come on.
I mean, this is a thing happening everywhere. Like, this is a thing happening in America right now as well, right? Like,
absolutely.
Let's ignore this part of history in schools. Like, they're too young to learn about this. Like, what?
It's gross.
It's a profound book. It's something that, even when I was a kid and I read it, it made me uncomfortable, but I'm glad I read it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Again, this was one of those things where I actually I found a first printing beguiling. We buy collections all the time. The first printing of Barefoot Gen in hardcover showed up in a collection. I was like, yoink, that one's for me.
Wow.
So work in a bookstore, kids, if you want rare books. That's today's pro tip. But yeah, I had to have it. Like it was tremendously affecting for me personally. And I've been to Hiroshima and to the city, but also specifically the Atomic Dome and to the Memorial Museum.
The
and Peace Park.
museum, like the dioramas. I was scarred
it's-
for a long time seeing the dioramas.
Yeah. It's I've been 3 times now. I keep bringing people there because we have to know. We have to know about this. It's hard. You cry. I've never left a museum to go cry in the washroom before, but I've done it twice in Hiroshima. Final thoughts on Manga, the world of Japanese comics. Anybody else go?
Super good. I think it was still very interesting, very informative, even with the outdatedness. But so Lupin the Third, I think there's 2 panels from Lupin in this book, which is one of my favorite animes. I love the manga quite a bit as well. And like they're 2 of the most unappealing possible panels to choose to recommend Lupin people.
What was it like? Him cutting through like?
He's inside like a dummy of a girl.
Yeah.
Which I think was like a cover, like a frontispiece for something. And then the other is like a sex scene, which is like a good gag, but it's not like Lupin.
Yeah, it doesn't sum up the character.
Yeah.
For some of these, this is the only glimpse I have of this work.
Yeah.
And if that's the first impression, that's kind of crazy, eh?
And I think maybe 5 years after I read this book, I saw the Lupin anime for the first time and was like, oh, this is everything I like in like one tight, 20-minute episode.
Yeah.
Amazing.
But other than that very small shortcoming, like I still really like manga, and I'm glad Christopher recommended it, but it's as long as 100 mangas, so I feel like he sort of set a new record, set a new bar in terms of making us read too much for the podcast.
I gave
At least
you
he gave
months.
us months. Yeah.
Yeah, and I used hours of those months on this book. So
Yeah.
Deb, what was your final thought on Manga, the world of Japanese comics?
I mean, this is just such a huge book for me. It's like one of my all-time favorites. I think I'm on my 4th copy of it now. I don't know where my original one was because it was a hardcover that came out in '83, but it was threadbare. It was falling apart. I read it, reread it so many times. It's really interesting for me to come back and read it again now that I know more.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, like seeing that some of the moment in time it was, and how things have changed, and things that are omitted that are actually really important. Seeing the evolution, and also kind of maybe that attitude at the time when it was written was like, "Hi, well, hey world, there's this cool stuff. Here's what I know about it. Won't you give it a try?" And now it's like, "Hi, this is the stuff that's taken over the world," and like all this, But at the same time, even though now manga is, we all know the world manga. Several of these works have been published in English. I'd say like 60 or 70% have not been published, which to me says how far we still need to go as far as really understanding the world of history and world of manga that in a way that we could.
Chipper, any final thought?
I quite liked it, even though it was text. And you know how I feel about text. Yeah, it was great. It was super informative, entertaining. I'm glad we kind of skipped talking about the section about the industry and how successful and how wealthy they all are, because that section made me a little depressed as a North American comics creator. So thank you for skipping by that.
I need a panel in an upcoming issue of Public Domain where something terrible happens to the crew, and there's just like a one panel. Meanwhile, in Japan, and it's just people bathing in money and and having a huge party, and then chapter
done and done.
Nice, love it.
Oh man,
yeah. Though once again, that section, I forget which artist they're talking about, mentioned they had like 13 people working for them, but that they still, maybe it was Tezuka who still did like all the kind of the penciling and the story and stuff, but like there were so many other elements that needed to be handled and managed. And once again, it just reminded me of Paws Incorporated and Jim Davis. Like it's almost exactly his setup. Jim Davis, who I consider the Tezuka of North America.
Hugely influential, tons of cartoons.
Yeah.
Infinite numbers of pages of comics created. Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, an industry unto himself. Anyways, great book. Good suggestion, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you. My final thought is that I was collecting a lot of random Japanese comics and even going to Japanese grocery stores in the 90s to try and just get more and to get closer to the source, because I never thought I'd make it to Japan. I never thought I would ever get to go. So for the kids out there that feel the same way, the people out there who feel the same way, you will get to go if you really want to make it happen. But buying copies of Young magazine just because I knew that's what Akira was in when Akira was serialized, very different in 1996 than it was in the early 80s when Akira was serialized. Buying copies of Shonen Jump, buying copies of just random stuff that I don't remember what it was because I couldn't read it. It was like just getting a puzzle piece or like 4 or 5 puzzle pieces per issue and not knowing what the hell anything was. And getting this book and starting at the Beguiling when manga was more and more prevalent was like getting the box that the puzzle pieces come in. It has the picture on the front. And I at least knew what the shape was supposed to be. And I still have to keep searching for all the pieces, and I'm still searching. I think this podcast is part of that for all of us. But yeah, Manga. It's a really important book, and I'm glad it exists. And if you want to read it, it is available on archive.org, the Internet Archive. I know it's sometimes very hard to find, sometimes out of print for long stretches, and might not be available. Oh, sorry, it is in print right now, although I just checked at Amazon and it says we've got 1 copy left. More might be on the way. And I do know that there are stretches where it's not available from distributors. It sometimes takes a year or two between printing. So support it if you can, pick it up if you can. But if not, there's an internet library for you, and it's probably in your local library as well. Support your local libraries. We don't just say that at the end of every week. We mean it. All right, that's been an episode of Mangasplaining, Manga, the World of Japanese Comics by Frederik Schodt. Available, as I said, kind of everywhere. Go check it out. We'll be right back after the break. And we are back, and we are running short on time. So we're going to do some quick shout-outs, kick off the season in a positive, fun, and exciting way. Who's seen or done anything in the last 2 months? Anybody?
I've done and seen and accomplished nothing. My shout out this week, I'm going to go with Doctors Without Borders. You can Google whatever their URL is, but they do a lot of good around the world. It's always good to donate if you can, tell people if you can't, that kind of thing. DoctorsWithoutBorders.org. That makes a lot of sense. Life is hard, but we can make it a little less hard for each other. So let's see if we can do that by giving money to people who can help.
That's great, and it makes my shout out just seem so frivolous.
Oh,
you son of a! Well, my shout out is the fun action rom-com, Mr. and Mrs. Smith on Amazon.
Really?
Okay. Yeah. Donald Glover, Maya Erskine. I didn't really know what to think kind of going into it, and it's just been absolutely delightful. I've watched like 5 episodes, and it's tense, it's sexy, it's like really insightful into relationships, and yeah, it's a far cry from the original movie. So, and it's gorgeous too. Like, if you feel kind of trapped and you want to go see Lake Como, yeah, check it out.
Deb, what's your shout out this week?
Gosh, that's tough. I wanted to try to find a book in manga that's worth checking out. That's available in English now, and we've already kind of mentioned a lot of them. I would say maybe the Poe Clan. The Poe Clan by Moto Hagio. It's
that's a good one.
It is the classic vampire manga that predates Interview with a Vampire. There was a big exhibit at Anglo-M, which breaks my heart that I did not see. But
it was beautiful, Deb. It was so beautiful. Oh my god.
Oh my god. Wait. Anyway, go on. Yes, it's a beautiful. It's complete in 2 volumes from Fantagraphics. Do pick it up. It's like, considering this is one of her early works in her early 20s, it is extremely masterful.
Nice.
I was just thinking, I actually didn't watch any TV or movies or anything on my very long plane rides from Taiwan to France and back. So I haven't actually seen anything, and I've only been reading stuff for work. I feel very out of touch with my shout outs. So let me just instead, since today we're right in the thick of it, wish everybody listening a happy Lunar New Year. I hope the Year of the Dragon is as good for you as it can possibly be, given the last few years and how they've gone.
Well, we're starting with a new season of Curb, so it's off to a good start.
That's my other shout out.
That show that's so embarrassing and awkward, I can't watch it. I'm with Jessica on this one, man.
Yeah.
So
I even tried.
Curb your enthusiasm is what you're saying.
Yeah, it has curbed my enthusiasm. Nice. All right, it's been an episode of Mangasplaining. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week with a very special episode on Daredevil Born Again. And I believe Chip's hosting that one. I guess we all got to figure out how to buy comics from Marvel online instead of everybody else. I'm sure it's on Kindle.
Wait, you're reading the Japanese edition.
Oh, yeah, okay. There we go.
There you go.
Hey, Bookwalker has that, right?
Finally, all right, some real everybody. Comics on this podcast.
Oh, it's gonna be an episode. I can't wait.